thank you for the invitation to be here with you today on this important occasion. As I listened to you, Dr. Luvunga, presenting some of the thinking that went into the establishment of this think and do tank, I could not but reflect on the broader context of development and of development thinking on our continent, and the tragic fact, which is as true perhaps for Mozambique as it is for almost every African country, of the disconnect between the world of thinking and research and the world of policy and action. I think this is a divide which has existed for a very long time. Students of post-independence African development and politics, from Dar es Salaam University to Makerere, from Ibadan University to Fort Hare, have debated the subject of how it is going to be possible to bridge that gap between the universe of thinking and of scholarship and research and the theater of policy and action on our continent. Understanding the basic dictum, which is a lesson that has been drawn from history, that no society actually ever successfully transforms itself, either on the basis of offshore, borrowed, externalized ideas, or on an agenda that fails effectively to nurture domestic research and thinking and to input this into the process of policy formulation and action. If you are Marxist-oriented, you will talk about the history and the role of the organic intellectual. Every transformation in the history of humankind has not been brought about except on the basis of organic ideas that have been generated within the historical context in which that transformation has occurred. And I hope that the effort which the ADS represents to try to create a think tank platform within Mozambique, in Southern Africa, joining other think tanks and do tanks across our continent to ensure that there is a constant generation of ideas, of policy ideas that can help our leaders to depend less on foreign ideas and to internalize more domestic ideas that respond to our questions and our concerns will eventually help us to also turn the table of underdevelopment on our continent. I think this is one of the most important lessons also which we can take from the history of the developmental state idea. Because after all, those countries which emerged in the 1950s, in the period after the Second World War, to try to catch up with the first developers, countries like the UK, France, and the United States, which were the first to industrialize, and which in a certain sense were pioneers. They understood, those late developers, the second generation of industrial powers that emerged into the world system, of countries like Japan, for example. They understood that it was important to nurture domestic ideas that understood first and foremost their circumstances, and secondly, the challenges of the world in which their country lived at the time they needed to achieve their takeoff and transformation, so as to be able to generate policies and action that would be relevant to the context. It would have been completely foolish of the Japanese to have simply attempted to mimic what the UK did in the 18th and 19th centuries to try to achieve their own developmental transformation in the 20th century. Now, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying here is not an appeal for an autarky of ideas. Ideas transcend boundaries ideas travel around the world. And eventually, the best of ideas become universal. But no idea begins originally by being universal. Every idea of a developmental kind begins as a local idea, right? Your slogan in the ADS is global and local, connecting the two. And I think it speaks volumes about the fact that development questions are often posed as, first and foremost, local questions, even if they are shared across frontiers around the world. And responses to them must also begin by taking into account local conditions and local contexts. It's a long-winded way of saying that the person or the group that will transform any society or which will develop any country must actually be the best ethnographers about that country. What is it that makes a country tick? What is it in the psychology and the mentality of the people that needs to be reinforced, to be altered, or to be transformed in order to pave the way for new ideas, for innovation, for audacity, and for the energy to change the order of things in that society. And precisely because of the centrality of the connection between knowledge and action, of the connection between research and transformative possibilities, was the reason why the Japanese, when they came of their own after the Second World War, the humiliating experience of being beaten in war was very devastating for the Japanese if you read their story. Their leaders decided that they were going to send people abroad to learn how other countries did it in order to understand and to adapt to their context the best way in which they would be able to create an efficient and functional state. One that will be capable of policy development, of policy coordination, and policy implementation. The Japanese experience was to lay the broad foundations, even if it was not the first effort that was made, the broad foundations which scholars were then to study in order to begin to talk about what we now refer to as the idea of the developmental state. And there several things were pulled out of that experience, which were reinforced in the course of the 1970s, when the East Asian countries, Korea, South Korea, of countries like Singapore, and a host of others, also began to chart their own path to development. And for these countries, what we might describe as the third generation of industrial powers, after the pioneers in Europe and the Japanese Industrial Revolution that was to follow. And the case of these East Asian nations, Southeast Asian countries, important battlegrounds of the Cold War, of the ideological contestation between the East and the West, drawing from the lessons of the first and second set of industrial powers, and also setting in place policies and action that prepared them for the work of transformation that they were to achieve. An important recurring decimal in all of the stories of the late developers and late industrializers was the central role of the reformation of the state, and with it, of the process of public policy. How do you build a state which thinks and breathes development on a daily basis? Was the central question. Now, what is the trigger that leads an elite, a political leadership, to ask that question is a different matter, which I will return to shortly. But for them, as with Japan, the key issue, against all of the criticism that have been made by mainstream economists about their prospects, remember Singapore. Singapore was given no chance at all. Economists actually at the time wrote that there was actually no point even designing a development plan for Singapore. It's a wasteland. Pretty much like the description that was given of Botswana at independence, a complete wasteland that has absolutely no chance. Desert, devoid of resources, nothing attractive in terms of physical features. Singapore had absolutely no chance. Korea divided, partitioned between warring camps in the Cold War. But for each of these, a political leadership emerged that asked the question, how do we build a state that is anchored on a developmental trajectory and a project of society? And it seems to me that one of the most important lessons in building a developmental state carried over from the Japanese experience into the East Asian countries, and to some extent even extended to Latin America, when a country like Brazil attempted to build a developmental state project, was the question of a national vision that will be shared across the board. A national vision about ourselves, which encapsulates our aspiration. A vision that defines an ideal for us, an ideal towards which society can be mobilized. A capacity to dream, and to dream of big and good things about ourselves. I know I may sound a bit like a bit like a preacher in this regard, but somehow these were societies that did not accept to be beaten and defeated by the history of setback and failure, but which rather, out of the experience of defeat and failure, decided that they were going to dream big about what was going to be possible for themselves. And that capacity to dream was not simply an abstract exercise. It was translated into a vision of the nation. Where does Singapore want to be in the next 50 years? Was the question which Lee Kuan Yew asked himself and posed to the rest of his colleagues when Singapore separated from Malaysia, given absolutely no chance, with a per capita income that was lower than the per capita income of most African countries at independence. And when Lee Kuan Yew asked that question before an audience of Singaporeans, saying we shall make this independence work, and in the next 50 years, Singapore will be counted amongst the greatest nations on earth. Some people might have called him a madman and described him as somebody who was probably drunk on something. To imagine that Singapore, no population, no natural resources, poverty, dirty, isolated. What are you talking about? Jumpstart that also to South Korea and Park Chung-hee, a general, coming out of a history of political instability in the country after a devastating war, and also raising the question, where does this South Korea wish to be in a period that is defined, and how shall we get there? And this is where the idea of a vision begins to make sense. A vision around which policy and politics can be organized. Please mark my words. A national vision which is broadly shared, around which policy and politics can be organized. So that politics ceases in the first instance to be about the self and about self-aggrandizement for the sake of it, an accumulation of wealth without any purpose, but defined in a context for the achievement of targeted goals in which disagreement within the political class is not a disagreement about vision, but about the fastest method to achieve that vision. That disagreement is not about ethnicity or religion, is not about origin or region, but about the vision that is commonly shared on the basis of what some scholars were later to describe as an elite consensus in society, in which leadership exercises itself on the basis of a competition on the fastest mechanism by which a national vision will be realized. And it was on the basis of this idea of a vision, the ideal of transformation, that the reformation of societal processes and institutions began to be undertaken, as much as in Japan in the 1950s, as in Singapore, Korea, subsequently Malaysia, Thailand, the East Asian Tigers as they came to be known in the period from the 1970s onwards. And one of the most important institutional sites of reform was the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in Japan as the bureaucracy in Singapore and South Korea. For those of you who want to get a much deeper insight into this, I will invite you to read the biography of Lee Kuan Yew, in which he said, amongst other things, that in rebuilding the Singaporean civil service to make it a development-oriented civil service, he took one of the toughest decisions of his life, that the permanent secretary in Singapore would be as qualified and as competent as the best CEO of any private company operating in Singapore. And that no permanent secretary would be paid less than the CEO of the average best performing private company in Singapore. With the consequence, therefore, that you are going to be tied to a performance target as a civil servant, a performance target that will be developed within the framework of a national development plan, in which if you are, for example, appointed as the permanent secretary for the Department of Transport of Singapore, with the idea of building Singapore Airlines into a global brand in aviation travel, there will be no excuses acceptable for not meeting your targets. You are well paid, you don't have to moonlight, you don't need to drive taxi at night in order to make for your income. Your housing is in the best part of the city, like any CEO. And God bless you if you are caught collecting money to buy substandard airplanes for Singapore Airlines. God bless you. Because you will go to jail. And there will be no excuse. And he stated this in his autobiography. The rules were clear. You are not admitted to any of those universities simply because you knew Adriano Nuvunga. Sorry. You can try that somewhere else, but not here. And coming out with first-class honors and wanting a career in the civil service, you are simply given the opportunity to fill the form to sit the common entrance. First class was not an automatic right to go into the civil service. You wrote an exam, and those who passed the exam the best were distributed into the civil service. This is what Peter Evans, in his book on the developmental state, described as the culture of meritocracy in the civil service. In my country, Nigeria, we say we do things on the basis of how man knows man, right? It didn't work in that context. You didn't need to know anybody. You just needed to have your qualifications and your grades, and you will be posted. And then get your targets on the basis of which you would perform your duties, located within a national development plan extracted out of a national vision. So that the idea of the national vision was not simply an abstract concept. Many of us in Africa, I worked as director of a planning institute, the United Nations Planning Institute, for 6 years. We don't have a shortage of documents. Absolutely no shortage. Every African country has a 5-year plan. Some countries even say they decided to do 10-year plans. But plans which are unrealistic and in which you have absolutely no belief. The plan is just a piece of document, sometimes to make yourself feel good, sometimes to make your donors happy, but the last thing you do is to believe in it. And if there's an opportunity to violate it, you are the first to violate it. So that the plan document in the Japanese context, located in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, mark the name, because Japan decided it was going to build its development project on the basis of an export-oriented strategy. Export-oriented. They created a super ministry, which was called the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, which was the one ministry in all of the Japanese civil service, which if you got into it, you actually congratulated yourself as being amongst the best of the best. And MITI had a coordination role, a coordinating role amongst other ministries, that no ministry, finance cannot do what they like. It has to be in line with the plan, for which MITI was the guardian. And in that process created a super coordination capacity that ensured that across sectors, Japanese domestic policy was consistent and coordinated with the ambition to transform Japan, and external policy was harmonized with that same ambition to transform Japan. You don't go and greet China because you like the new leader in China. It's an opportunity to go and shake their hands. You go there with a purpose that will be defined carefully for you by what MITI says, that in order for us to meet our target, this is what we need from China. It's a level of detail and commitment which only a meritocratic bureaucracy fired by a national vision in which they believe, for which they are authors, which they own, and which they break down into annual implementation programs within seasonal plans are driven. And this was all of the debate in the 1970s, that with the developmental states that had emerged, what was Africa supposed to do? How were we to begin to try to build this culture of development that would enable us to transform the continent along the lines which within a generation or two, countries like Japan, like the East Asian nations were able to do. You can imagine in the context of the debate that there were scholars who took the view from the beginning that forget it. A developmental state project is not possible in Africa. I think, Excellency, you are right, Ambassador of Switzerland. Poverty is not a fatalistic condition. We are not condemned to underdevelopment on the continent. I think in my own view, in arguing against that position, that it is not doable, it is not possible, don't think about it. Meritocratic bureaucracy, a state that is strong and interventionist in the public interest, not for the enrichment of private interests, of a state that disciplines the private sector behind a common public purpose, that masters the market in order to be able to create more opportunities for business to grow, that is forward-looking, which is imagining what the world would look like in 50 years. What kinds of mobile phones are we going to be holding in 50 years? Already thinking about it and putting money in research and development. Africa is not there yet. We are still struggling with nation building. We are even still trying to build the state. We are not even sure whether we still want to live together or create more countries. Every big ethnic group wants to be a country of its own. And there was no shortage of opinion that said the developmental state idea is not possible in Africa. Perhaps one of the most compelling of arguments that was made in the 1980s and 90s against the idea of the developmental state in Africa was the one that argued that Africa has known dictatorship and authoritarianism. But how come it never delivered development? What was the trade-off? What was the point of Idi Amin's dictatorship in Uganda? Or what was the point of single-party rule or military rule in many parts of Africa? And how come, unlike General Park Chung-hee in South Korea, a military dictator too, who emerged as the transformative leader of his country, our own dictatorships and authoritarian regimes did not deliver development? If anything, they left us a legacy of war and division, such that by the 1990s, as the Cold War ended and authoritarian systems began to unravel, we actually entered a phase which Mericaldo was to describe as Africa's new wars. We had more conflicts, actually, enveloping the continent. Somalia collapsed, virtually. Sudan, name it, every region of the continent. The genocide in Rwanda was taking place. Burundi, instability, all of it in the 1990s. I'm arguing that maybe the time had not yet come for the developmental state idea on the continent. My disagreement, however, with that position is a very simple one. The desire for development is part and parcel of the culture and the dynamic of every society. Who hates development? Because to say that a society is not ready for development is actually to suggest that people are incapable of innovating about their own existence. After all, development, when we strip it of all the academic jargon, is about our capacity not only to make sense of the present, but also to build the resilience that prepares us for the future. Of our capacity to use what we have at hand in order to secure today and also prepare for our tomorrow. And that is precisely, I think, what Africa has known for a long historical period, until the history of the last 500 years began to create what Walter Rodney described as the historic underdevelopment of Africa, of the gap that was to develop between Africa and the rest of the world, as to justify the categorization of the continent as one of the backwaters of the world. But the struggles which were fought for independence in all of our countries were also struggles about development. There were struggles about how we would overcome the backwardness that was imposed by forces of globalization in a way that not only weakened us politically, but also subordinated us economically, reducing us to producers of raw materials to feed the development of others. And overcoming that requires putting in place a number of things which I would like to address now in making the case for the developmental state in Africa. It seems to me that one of the most important missing links in the experience which we have built over the last 50 years, 60 years of independence in Africa, that one of the most important missing links has been the absence of a recognition to get its politics right and therefore to build the governance framework for managing its own affairs in a stable, predictable framework, that country cannot even begin to take off. And it is ironic that it took a full 30 years after the introduction of structural adjustment in the 1980s for even institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to finally accept that the first step in the journey of development is getting politics right. The World Bank actually described it by saying, for those of you who do a lot of literature, the World Bank described it by saying that having economic reforms in the way it proposed in the 80s without commensurate political governance reforms was like having Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, without the Prince of Denmark. It's impossible. It's not going to work. They even used the metaphor of Gorbachev in the 1990s in Russia. No perestroika without glasnost. And that Africa needed its own glasnost in order to be able to mobilize the forces for societal transformation, which is development. So getting politics right, getting the governance frame right, and doing the original thinking that is needed in order to build the environment of stability and of predictability for various actors to function, whether in public or in private, the state or the market, is the number one prerequisite, which we haven't managed to crack on the African continent. In many ways, 60 years of independence for too many countries on our continent have been years of a search for that formula, of how do we get it right. I come from a country, 200 million people almost, and that country manages to break every regime that comes in. Regimes don't break Nigeria. Nigerians break their government. We can get it. Just to find the formula, how do you govern that country? No matter the ambition of any political leader who comes into power in many of our countries on the continent, the absence of that formula for governing in a stable and predictable manner on the basis of rules that we all adhere to, that absence effectively cripples the capacity of governments to function effectively. A second lesson, and the deficit which we have, is an assumption that we can import development. They did it like that in Korea. We will do it also. Taiwan did it on the basis of small and medium enterprises. Let's try small and medium enterprises too. Then somebody else comes and tells us that no, they did an export-led model. We also say we want to do an export-led model. The truth of the matter is that development cannot be exported, because no two experiences of development are the same. We talk of the East Asian countries, and if you read most of the literature, you will be tempted to assume that they all did the same thing at the same time. In fact, when we look at the matter more closely, we would realize that there are as many parts to the developmental state as there are developmental states. That no two experience of the developmental state project are exactly the same. Taiwan's path was different from the path that was taken by Singapore. Singapore's path was different from the path that was taken by Malaysia. And Malaysia's path was different in its detail from the path that was taken by South Korea. And Thailand also adopted its own mix of policies and measures, sectoral priorities and strategic approaches in order to achieve the structural transformation which it requires. Development is not mimicry. No society develops by mimicking others. And we have done a lot of mimicry in Africa, believing that if we somehow manage to do it on the basis of what we are told other people did, we will get there. Actually, Ha-Joon Chang, the Cambridge economist of South Korean descent, wrote a book called The Bad Samaritan. The Bad Samaritan is a book I recommend to those of you who want to read about this. It's basically that actually Africans need to wake up and understand that the world does not owe you a living. Because you might call in a South Korean and say, please tell us Mozambicans, how did you do it? And the South Korean is going to give you a stylized account, a completely sanitized account of how South Korea did it, which if you try to apply in the context of Mozambique, you are going to be lost forever. And this is essentially the message that we need, as Cabral said, to think with our own heads in order to find solutions for our own particular problems. The challenges which face us in Africa today are challenges which are specific to us at this point in time. Of a population of young people that comprise about 60% of our total population, of which in the best performing African countries, a full 30% of them are unemployed and have absolutely no prospect of employment. It's a ninja generation. No income. If you remember Gecko in the movie Money Works, no income, no jobs, no assets, absolutely no prospect available to them. Perhaps that might be the number one question we need to solve, not somebody else's number one problem, which we import and make into our own problem and begin to wonder why policies and measures which we pursue don't seem to work. It's also a way of saying that developmental states use external support, but no developmental state project, indeed no societal project of transformation, has ever worked in history on the basis of aid. On the basis of aid. We spend too much time, our leaders spend too much time going to ask for aid and saying to other people, give us more. Last year you promised us 20 billion, you delivered only 15. This year we estimate we need 40. And we fly all over the place to hold meetings, JICA.
Development doesn't happen by magic. It's human beings. It's human beings who have skills, who have knowledge. And those human beings are only produced on the basis of an investment in them. And for those who advise many of our governments to say, take your human resources seriously, you might be able to reap a demographic dividend, but it is not guaranteed if you do not invest in people, in their education, the education of the young people, in the building of skills and the renewal of competencies and capacity in a way that will make citizens useful to themselves and ultimately useful to society itself. The best examples of the most successful democratic developmental states which we have seen in the world are those that have invested most heavily in people and in R&D. Look at the figures for Singapore, look at the figures for South Korea. At a point in time, it became policy in Singapore and South Korea to take the best young people from their countries and send them not just to any college in the United States and Europe, but to the Ivy Leagues. If a Korean student would go to the United States in order to study on government scholarship in the United States, you better find Yale, you better find Harvard, you better find Columbia, and other such Ivy League institutions. They are not going to give you scholarship to go and study in some community college. And you understand that at the end of your education, you are coming back home. And the rate of return of Korean-sponsored, government-sponsored students, the last time I checked the figure, was well over 90%. Translate that also for China. translate it for Singapore, and you see a deliberate building of capacity, and the making of the requisite investment in human resources that will help them to be competitive for today and to be ready for tomorrow's competition. Education has been said many times is a key element of the effort at developmental transformation. But development of the kind which took place in East Asia on the basis of highly authoritarian methods of governance is clearly not one that can work in Africa. We've tried it anyway, and it didn't take us anywhere. And there is a sense in which those who will transform Africa must also understand that for better or for worse, this continent is condemned to democracy. We better make that democracy work. With all of its imperfections, from cycle to cycle, development makers on the continent who would transform our Africa must also simultaneously think of a democratic framework within which that transformation will take place. And here, the idea of a democratic developmental state is of one that will reconcile the demands of democratic governance and participation with the demands of developmental transformation. And it is conciliable. We are not condemned to choose either or. Because sometimes we are told you either choose democracy or you choose development. It doesn't have to be so. Nor do we need to delay democracy in order to achieve development, or delay development in order to achieve democracy. Because the best experiences of human development have also built into them the empowerment of people in the way that it was described by the Nobel economist Amrito Sen in his book, Democracy as Freedom. Development as freedom. Because the very process of development comes with an empowerment of citizens, which the managers of development would do well to recognize by also adapting institutions in order to allow for the participation of citizens in tandem with their empowerment in a democratic project. And so the idea also that in building development, the best planners would think of ways in which to ensure that deliberation and participation are inbuilt into the process. And this, I think, is also one of the biggest challenges we are faced with on our continent today. We have many countries that have had success in holding repeat elections, in having alternation of power between ruling and opposition parties, but which have consistently failed to deliver any development dividends to the populace, and which are mired in the same kinds of policies. No difference whether you vote party A out and bring in party B, regardless of manifesto, they implement the same thing, because the dictates about your development policy come essentially from outside of your shores and not on the basis of the internal requirements of your economy and society. The scholars have described our situation as one of choiceless democracies, not developmental democracies, of choiceless democracies, of democracies that offer no choice to the citizen, in which citizens vote without choosing. You go through the ritual, you vote, you put the ink on your thumb, but you really haven't exercised any choice, because regardless of who comes in, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it appears to change, the more it is the same thing. And changing that equation of a choiceless democracy to a developmental democracy is one of the challenges to which we must respond. The In order to achieve all of these prerequisites that I indicated, I cannot imagine that it will ever be possible if we also do not bridge that gap between policy and action, between research and evidence, and between policy choice and policy action. And it is institutions like yours, ADS, that will need first and foremost to do the thorough research that is required, or aggregate research that has been done on the circumstances of Mozambique, of Southern Africa, of the rest of the continent. What is the number one development problem confronting Mozambique? What is the number one democratic question confronting Mozambique? What original solutions can we propose? And how can those solutions be brought to the attention of political society and to the government? And in the end, we might find that actually, between government, civil society, the private sector, focused on a common goal of changing the history of poverty and underdevelopment, of corruption and instability, towards a story of structural transformation and of the empowerment of citizens. We are actually all united by a common project. Thank you.